Now it's my pleasure to introduce our next session. It's a discussion between Evan Miyazono, research team lead at Protocol Labs, and Tom Kalil, the chief innovation officer at Schmidt Futures. At Schmidt Futures, Tom heads initiatives to harness technology for societal challenges, improve science policy, and identify and pursue 21st century moonshots. He has previously helped design science and technology initiatives for the Obama and Clinton administrations. Schmidt Futures is building a network of top innovators to solve hard problems. And today, Tom and Evan will have a fireside chat of sorts, discussing opportunities outside of traditional research structures.
For those of you who don't know, Tom has done what I would think most people would consider many careers worth of improving science and technology. And that includes designing and launching the BRAIN initiative, as well as many other initiatives around nanotechnology, robotics, space, increasing access to capital for various technology startups, leading the initiative for the next generation internet, reshaping interdepartmental collaborations in academia at the University of California, Berkeley as special assistant to the chancellor for science and technology, and just like an overall very exciting and impressive, well-rounded portfolio of exposure and improvements across the science and technology as a system. I wanted to start things off by saying that you've led creation of massive national initiatives advancing science and technology, and you're now leading the development of innovative programs at Schmidt Futures, which is, while on the larger side of private philanthropy, still significantly smaller than government. I'd be curious, but naturally I expect comes with its own pros and cons in addition, other than just capital. I'd love to hear some of the lessons you've learned from working in government and how working in philanthropy is different.
Well, thanks so much for the invite. I'm really looking forward to our discussion. So I had the privilege of working for two presidents for 16 years. So there were a lot of different things that I learned, but let me just talk about a couple. So one is that there's definitely a mindset that I required, which was a belief that there were more things in the world that were potentially changeable because they're the result of human action or inaction, as opposed to being fixed. And the easiest way to describe that is I had the ability to send a decision memo to the president and have him check the box that said yes. And so after that happened a number of times, there were many instances where someone would say, boy, wouldn't it be great, if we could do the following? And then my brain would just start thinking about okay, how, if I thought that was a genuinely good idea, how would I actually make that happen? So I used to pose the following thought experiment to people when I would meet them. You have a meeting with the president and he says, Evan, if you give me a good idea for the decentralized funding of public goods, then I will call anyone on the planet. It can be a conference call, so there can be more than one person on the line. If it's someone inside the government, like the head of the NIH or the National Science Foundation or DARPA, then I can direct them to do something because I'm their boss. And if it's someone outside the government, like the head of a major philanthropy or a university president or CEO of a company or a professional society, then I can challenge them to do something. And Evan, what you need to tell me is not only what your idea is, but in order to make your idea happen, who would I call and what would I ask them to do in the form A does B, so C. And so an example of the way this would play out is a group of scientists and engineers came to talk to me and they said, we think the time is right to launch an initiative that would do for neuroscience what the Genome Project did for genetics. And what I was thinking was, well, actually, there are only 3 people in the United States government that I would need to convince. And I helped recruit 2 of the 3 of them. So I think I have a fighting chance to actually get this done. So long story short, they all said yes. The president said yes and included it in his State of the Union address. And then Congress did something that they almost never do, which is they provided for the NIH component of the BRAIN initiative 10 years of dedicated funding. So the mindset that I acquired was a sense of agency, that a sense that, like, if someone brought me an idea or I had an idea, then I had, some non-zero chance of getting it to happen. But I needed to be able to answer the question of, like, essentially, who would you call and what would you ask them to do? And then the skill set that I acquired was figuring out how to actually build that coalition of the willing and able of people and organizations, both inside and outside government, taking some mutually reinforcing steps that are designed to make that happen. So that's what I learned from my time in government. I guess I also learned that I have a higher than average ability to get excited about other people's ideas. And what I discovered is that if you have that, then the number of things that you get to work on goes way up. So as opposed to saying, well, I'm only going to work on things that, I, Tom Kalil, had some unique insight in with respect to this idea, because it's like Bill Joy said, no matter who you work for, most of the smartest people work for someone else. And so I think if you have that mindset of saying, well, doesn't care who was the author of this idea, maybe there's some contribution that I can play in actually making it happen. So that's what I learned on some of the things I learned from my public service.
That's really interesting. To what extent do you think about the reframing of problems like, I wish this thing existed, to the like concrete A does B does C, in terms of understanding of systems of humans and also the affordances in the world? I often feel like a lot of the limits on people's ability to do the things that they want to do seems like it's risk aversion and like habit, and also like not, I guess, understanding enough of the pieces of the system to know that it's possible for them to do a thing.
Yes.
And like, is this also a rare skill set? Is this something that you've seen people get much better at? Are there recommendations you have other than practice, which I assume is also very important?
It's all about the reps, Evan. No,
10,000 hours.
I think it's also about understanding different institutions. So an example is, let's say that you were in my position, working for you were working for the president, and you were trying to get DARPA to do something, right? So one of the things that you have to know about DARPA is that it's really driven by the individual program managers. And so if I would have a conversation with the DARPA director and say, hey, I'm really excited about launching this BRAIN initiative, then the first thing she's going to ask me is, great, where, do I currently have a program manager that you could work with? And if not, what are you going to do to help me find a, world-class program manager who's going to work in neurotechnology? The fact that if you're a DARPA program manager, you have to be able to answer the Highmark catechism, which is a set of questions that every program manager has to be able to answer. The fact that they have this bar of what they're going to work on, which is something DARPA hard. The joke at DARPA is, if you don't invent the internet, then you get a B. And so, if something is more incremental in nature, then they're not going to work on it, right? So part of it is to say, okay, given the problem that I'm trying to solve, what is the Ocean's 11 that I need to pull together in order to solve that problem? And what is the right division of labor based on the missions and capabilities of different types of individuals and organizations, assuming that it's not the type of thing that you can just, solve by yourself, but you need to build some coalition. So those, I've tended to work on those problems as opposed to, I'm a software engineer and this is a problem that is I can solve just by writing code, right? If you're trying to say, could we do for neuroscience what the Genome Project did for genetics? There's no single individual who can make that happen. But if you build a powerful enough coalition, then you can make progress towards a goal like that.
Yeah, it definitely seems like there's some like systems perspective on like people interacting with smaller contained systems that they have good world models of, and people don't often have the capability or the awareness that they could engineer, like take leverage point, like make actions on leverage points that would change larger system behavior. I want to go into like a digression that's like probably way too specific and tactical.
Sure.
So I think it might be interesting to people who are specifically trying to use the Highmark catechism. I've answered the questions a few times, and the thing that always gets me is I never know exactly what depth to do because to answer them in, because it feels like I could turn them into like I could give my answers in like one sentence with a lot of assumed context, or I could write like a book chapter on each of them. And like I'm curious to hear when you've seen this succeed really well tactically, if you were going to recommend to other people, like it's useful to fill out the Highmark or to follow the Highmark catechism and answer these questions to make sure you understand the scope of what you're trying to do. What level of depth specifically do you think is most useful?
It depends who the audience is, right? So for example, if I'm dealing with a policymaker, so one of the initiatives that I worked on was the National Nanotechnology Initiative. And the most important thing that I did to get President Clinton and others excited about it is I would ask the research community, hey, if we gave you additional funding for nanoscale science and engineering, what are some of the things that might come out of it, even if it's going to take a long time? And they would say things that to like a policymaker were totally incomprehensible. We could store 10 to the 15 bits per cubic centimeter, develop materials with a Young's modulus of this many gigapascals, and create functionalized MRI contrast agents. And what I did was I turned that into storing the Library of Congress in a device the size of a sugar cube, making materials that are stronger than steel in a fraction of the weight, and detecting cancerous tumors before they're visible to the human eye. And armed with those examples, I was able to convince President Clinton to go to Caltech, which was great because he could reference Richard Feynman's "There's Plenty of Room at the Bottom" speech from the 1950s to say, I, President Clinton, am going to propose doubling the federal funding for nanoscale science and engineering. And that's resulted in $36 billion in funding. There was a separate conversation that we were having with the research agencies that resulted in, a 300-page research agenda on things like increasing our fundamental understanding of the size-dependent properties of nanoscale materials, devices, and structures. And that was a radically different conversation than the conversation that I was having with the president's speechwriter. So it's really all about who your audience is. And there is never any magic document that you create, which works in all settings. I generally find that you want to be able to describe something at like the 1 or 2 sentence level. My favorite version of this is the way this movie Aliens was greenlit, was with the line, "It's Jaws in space," and that was sufficient to get funding for it. So you have to be able to have a conversation at that level. But then there are other people who are going to be really interested in the technical details of, hey, you say that within 5 years that we could do X. What is it specifically that it's changed about the world that leads us to believe that you could actually do that, right? And they're going to want to know like a lot more technical details. So I'm afraid the answer to that question is it depends. But what I would say is that there's a real value in being able to have conversations with multiple types of of people with different backgrounds. So one of the ways, to the extent that I've created any societal value, one of the ways in which I've done that is to be a part of different networks, in the same way that you might observe the social graph in high school as being divided between, jocks, theater kids, and stoners. So they're in terms of policymakers, a lot of them have a law background or economics background. They worked on the Hill, they worked on campaigns, they worked at a think tank. If you ask them how many electrical engineers do you know? The answer is sometimes zero, right? And so in the 90s, I was one of two people who was both working in the White House and was interacting with the computer science research community. And one day in 1993, a group of people at DARPA showed me what it looked like when Mosaic was connected on a T3 line, a 45 megabit per second line, which in 1993 was very unusual. So they had created a time machine. They were allowing the research community to live in a future that ultimately everyone would get to experience. And I was able to engage in information arbitrage between the computer science, the cutting edge of the computer science research community and the head of the National Economic Council and say, hey, this internet thing is going to be big, right? Which in 1993, the view in industry is, oh, that's an academic plaything, and it's going to be replaced by, 500 channels of video on demand, which was, what their view of what the information superhighway was going to be. Or some of them thought it was going to be something called asynchronous transfer mode, as opposed to just saying, oh, IP can run over faster and faster networks, and you're going to have the system where a 23-year-old can come up with an application like Mosaic, and it can rapidly diffuse across the entire network.
And I presume that led to the Next Generation Internet Initiative.
Yes.
That's fantastic. Yeah, I really love the practice of certain groups investing huge amounts to build something that will be more common in the future, to figure out what else should be along in that future. I think Xerox PARC is known for having done something like that to computation. Yeah. And also I appreciate the answer that it matters the context when you answer these questions. I find that I'm often answering them for myself or a team with high context, but communicating that to more people, I think it'll be very interesting. And I do find it very interesting, very useful for communicating ideas as a starting point. I wanted to go back to something you had said previously around the superpower of being able to get very excited about other people's ideas. You had mentioned the idea of a field strategist to me previously, yes. And that was something I got very excited about. And I would love to have you explain what a field strategist is and why you think they're important.
Yeah. So one piece of context is that you now have 2,000 families who have $500 million or more in wealth, and their current level of philanthropy is 1.2%. So most of them have been doing much better than 1.2% in terms of their return on investment. So they could be dramatically increasing their level of philanthropy with no net reduction in their wealth. One challenge is that one option is that they could go out and recruit a large professional staff, like the Gates Foundation has done, and said, all right, I'm going to delegate to my staff the decision about what to fund. But a lot of them are still very active professionally and don't have any interest in having to deal with this large foundation. The issue is that if they have unmediated access to the research community, any normal researcher that they interact with will say, well, it's obvious what you should do with your money. You should fund my lab. And they're not going to have a very easy way of sort of adjudicating between those decisions. So every once in a while, I run into someone who has a view about what would advance an entire field forward. And I find that to be more compelling from the point of view of a philanthropist, because so I'll give you a concrete example of a young scientist who has a background in both automation, machine learning, and protein engineering. And her hypothesis is that with a relatively targeted investment, we could get protein engineering labs around the country to embrace things like cloud labs. And that would increase the reproducibility of events. It would free up more time for graduate students and postdocs to think about what experiments they should design as opposed to pipetting. And it would create data of the quality and uniformity that could drive forward machine learning assisted protein engineering in the same way that the protein data bank and the CASP competition played a really important role in protein structure and the DeepMind's AlphaFold 2 result. So that's an example of someone who's saying, hey, don't fund my lab, but I have this view about a public good or a series of investments that could move the entire field forward. And so what I think we should have is a three-sided marketplace between a philanthropist who has significant financial resources, or maybe you're going to come up with a DAO that will crowdfund a small amount of money from a large number of donors. That's cool too. The field strategist who is saying, this is my investment thesis, and this is the strategy that I'm going to use for deploying some philanthropic capital. And then the third part is the research community, or whatever community that they're interacting with and supporting. So I think that could address the sort of paralysis by analysis that many funders face, which is there's so many different options, and in the absence of a large professional staff, they don't really have a mechanism for making choices. So one that, as you know, the CEO of Protocol Labs supported was impetus grants, and Martin Borsch Jensen said, hey, fast grants was successful. Why don't we have a fast grants, but for longevity research? And he had the credibility to say, I will do a good job of allocating this funding because I can put together the necessary network of reviewers and help you feel confident that your money will be used well. And I'm not just showing up and saying, fund my lab. So I would like to raise the status of that function, because I think it could unlock a lot of philanthropic capital and allow us to support some initiatives that address key bottlenecks.
Do you have thoughts on how to raise the status, or are there additional things that you think we need, like more robust or rigorous training in addition to just having status in order to have more people doing this?
Yeah, so I think that these program managers at the ARPAs definitely learn a number of different techniques for how to identify opportunities with outsized impact. And for example, one is the observation that there are two, research communities that are currently not interacting with each other. But if they did, it would be the equivalent of combining chocolate and peanut butter. And so really what we need to do is just provide a problem that both of them could contribute to as sort of a shared task, right? So that's an example. We support the work of Adam Marblestone and his colleagues like Anastasia, who I think are asking the research community a really interesting question, which is, are there bottlenecks in your field that could be better addressed if you had a novel funding mechanism? So if you, their hypothesis is that there's a class of scientific and technical problems that is not a good fit for either academia or a startup, and that what is needed is a well-funded, time-bound research nonprofit organization. And what I think is so magical and generative when you find a question like this, it's a question that some researchers come up with good answers to, and they never thought about it before because there would have been nothing to do with the answer.
It creates a new affordance, the existence of FROs.
Yeah. So, most people are not going to say, oh, like imagine that you had a new institutional innovation. How would that change things? But that's too vague, right? It's the fact that it's like, it's not like, oh, you have a magical wish from a genie. No, it's like you have 20 people working for 5 years where there's actually a CEO and everyone it's like a well-run startup in the sense of that there's a unity of purpose and everyone is focused on one thing, as opposed to all the individual graduate students and postdocs having to worry about whether they're going to get their own first author paper and have their own unique intellectual contribution. So I think that there's some questions that are generative in nature there where researchers never thought about them because the expected value for coming up with a good answer is 0. And I think Erica's question is also in that category, which is, if you had a large cloud lab, could you generate a data set that would do for some area of science what the protein data bank and CASP did for the protein folding problem? And again, it's not a question that I think a lot of researchers stay up at night thinking about. But my belief is that if we could motivate more of them to answer that question, they would generate a project that could have a high impact.
Yeah,
so Evan, tell me how you're going to get the Web3 community to solve that problem for me.
I mean, one of the things that I can start by doing is saying to everyone watching this, ask this question of every scientist you know. And if you get good answers or get answers that seem more interesting than fund our lab, then please forward them along, send them to comments@protocol.ai, and like we'll pass them along. It's an interesting question of like you could try and propagate this question in a top-down way, and like try to go through normal funding channels and make people aware that this is like make this come up on all of the like search engines for calls for funding. But you could also do this in a more bottom-up way, and the bottom-up way ends up being much more Web3, and it'll be interesting to try and propagate this through the various networks. I think we're all of the decentralized science movement, it still feels very nascent and amorphous. And I'd like to crystallize around some of these goals, especially because there are people with design mentalities or with like community governance mentalities and backgrounds who can see this in terms of like what makes an affordance most effective. And I definitely see like the specific questions, like you have a network that exists for 5 years with 15 people is like a great example of the constraints liberate and liberties constrain philosophy. With like the more these are real questions, the more real answers I think we'll get. It'll be interesting to see if we can try and gather people around some of these like novel and like highly effective questions that people can be aware answers have like strong, like high marginal value to, which they might not have understood before.
Yes. Yeah. And I think in general, given the huge amount of potential for philanthropy, that the return to agenda setting has gone up. And by agenda setting, I don't mean anything more complicated than where are we now, where do we want to be, and how are we going to get there? And I think that there are, more people who are moving up Maslow's hierarchy of needs to self-actualization. And one of the ways they can do that is to help support something that is really important. My view of the question I have for philanthropists is, what would it take for you to be like the Medicis of the 21st century? In the same way that the Medicis helped fuel the Italian Renaissance by being patrons of the arts. Could you play a similar role in terms of addressing some of the big challenges that we face in the 21st century, like accelerating the transition to a carbon neutral economy, or dealing with antibiotic resistance, or just answering fundamental questions like, are we alone in the universe, or why is the universe expanding at an accelerating rate, or how did life begin, right? So I think both the expansion of knowledge about ourselves and the world around us as an end in itself, but also the instrumental role that science and technology can play, as we saw with mRNA vaccines in terms of addressing COVID, or the fact that solar and wind and electric vehicles are now being able to compete with fossil fuels. I don't want to suggest that science and technology is the answer to every question, but if you're going to look at a problem and come up with a list of 4 to 5 things to try, I think there's a rebuttable presumption that one of the things on that list should be science and technology.
Yeah, I strongly agree with that. And I really loved the connection to philanthropists being the Medicis of the future. I've often looked at philanthropy from like the golden age of robber barons and trusts. And like you saw a lot of fantastic institutions come out of that. But it's interesting the extent to which the universities that were the result of a lot of that wealth don't seem to be very properly suited to solving the biggest problems of today. They seem to train people into like these modern guilds, take the form of departments. But like every major problem, I love pointing out that if someone came to me and said, I'm picking a major as an undergrad, the only thing I care about is like building a user empowering brain computer interface, or I only care about mitigating the risks and dangers of climate change. What department should I major in? And I can make real strong, like very compelling arguments for like 6 different departments across like from economics to political science to electrical engineering and material science. And like, we don't have good, I will be able to tell that person, like, go here, become a field strategist. Because that's what we need for these problems.
Well, so I don't know if you know this, but the National Academy of Engineering was involved working with a number of universities in something called the Grand Challenge Scholars Program.
I was not aware of that.
And the idea is, the way I've been thinking about this is that students should major in a discipline but minor in a problem. So, we talk about people being T-shaped, right? That the T is their depth. Like for example, it might be in like computer science or some field of engineering or something like that. But the top of the T is the systems view of the problem, studied because universities have departments, the world has problems, right? And so the organizing principle for the top of the T should be a problem, not, oh, I majored in computer science and I minored in economics, right?
Yeah, it's availability, availability bias, I think, and like that when you have a hammer, everything's a nail. It's like usually the way people approach problems.
So like, I started a program. I started a program at Cal called Big Ideas at Berkeley. The premise of which was that students have ideas of their own, that we shouldn't just view them as subcontractors to their faculty advisors. And they often need ridiculously small amounts of money to get started. And so I supported a group of engineers who were really interested in safe drinking water in the slums of Mumbai. And they arrived thinking that this was a technical problem. We're going to develop a water filter that is effective and can be made from locally available parts for less than $10. So that was their problem framing. And then they came back and they were like, oh, there are these, people called slumlords, and, like the mothers have this sort of like fatalistic attitude that they're, that having dysentery is just like part of growing up. And why are we flying halfway around the world to work on this? And students at the local universities are not working on this at all. So they came back with this like much richer systems level understanding of the problem. And they were like, there is a technical component to this, but it's about 20% of the problem. And it's 80% that we didn't learn about in our like thermodynamics course or something like that. And so I think experiences like that would be incredibly effective at empowering students to tackle some big problem at home and abroad.
I often think of like processes like progress or science or research or things like that as like the software that runs on a stack that's like at the bottom is like humans. Yes. And humans have like intrinsic bugs in the form of cognitive biases. They have like interpersonal bugs in the form of like communication failures and misunderstandings. And like if you solve the technical problem, you need to propagate this down into the stack deeper, and you need to be able to expect that you can't just port from one group of people to another the same problem or the same solution. One of the things you said earlier about like there seems to be more openness to agenda setting, like path setting, pathfinding, whatever we want, like whatever name makes sense and doesn't sound as sinister. I think one of the things that makes me particularly excited about is that it seems like a lot of this this road mapping, this agenda set is being done in public and very collaboratively, because as you're saying, with the higher levels of Maslow's hierarchy, there's like the end goal is creating these public goods or common goods or in the form of knowledge goods or things like that. It becomes very clear that we have this cooperate equilibrium when we get to this. And do you see any effective way to communicate this cooperate equilibrium to people who are skeptical of a lot of these endeavors? It seems like a lot of people will, like, even if there is like an agenda on how we can increase something like vaccines or safe drinking water, how might one go about trying to make that more effective on like the social or cultural level?
Yeah, it's a great question. So one of the things that I would be interested in seeing emerge is a marketplace of outcomes that has at least four different types of participants. So one is the sponsor. So for example, this might be the role that Operation Warp Speed played in telling Pfizer, hey, if you develop a vaccine that is safe and effective and gets an emergency use authorization, then we will buy 300 million doses. Or NASA saying to SpaceX, we will provide you a series of milestone payments if you can develop a rocket that can go up to the International Space Station and deliver and retrieve cargo. Or the role that Stripe is playing in trying to jumpstart the market for carbon dioxide removal. So that's one type of entity. The second type of entity are the teams that believe that they can contribute to that goal. The third is the investors, which could be commercial or philanthropic, that are maybe providing upfront capital that's needed to go after these and doing diligence on the teams and figuring out which ones they think are most likely to be successful. And the fourth are the people who are actually designing the market. So the current situation is that right now the government is really good at making financial commitments that are contingent on failure. And those are loan guarantees. So the government has trillions of dollars of loan guarantees on its books. And that's the government saying, if this individual or firm goes bankrupt, then we will assume their debt obligations. And what I've been trying to do in a very modest incremental way is increase the capacity of the government to make financial commitments that are contingent on success. So I was able to work with the Congress to get DARPA prize authority, which they used for the self-driving car competition, which led to Waymo and Google X, because the second time they ran the competition, Sebastian Thrun's team won, and Larry Page was at the finish line and promptly acquired the winning team. And then when I came back into government, I was able to get every agency prize authority for up to $50 million. So if viewers go to challenge.gov, you'll see hundreds of instances in which the agencies are posing some problem and then agreeing to provide some reward for that. So I think this is something that we should be doing a lot more of. That is to say, are there instances where we can define a problem and / solution space with sufficient clarity so that we would be able to provide financial commitments that are contingent on success. And I know that Protocol Labs has been thinking a lot about networked OKRs, which is another really interesting way to think about this. But, I think a lot of it is like, what problem are we trying to achieve? And could we, define success in a way that is more performance-based, as opposed to, success is will ultimately be defined by some committee of experts, which is the way that we do prospective funding for using peer review and mechanisms like that.
Like, are you funding proactively or retroactively, and are you evaluating the amount proactively or retroactively? Yeah. And there's like, it becomes very interesting. For some of these, you can also have the criteria be set objectively or subjectively. Mm-hmm. And it seems like for the most part, it's like very hard to do things objectively, proactively, but like you can set very realistic goals of like, look, if you achieve this benchmark, then like you unlock this funding. There's nothing and like smart contracts can become very great for that if you have like an oracle that can detect that, or those sorts of things. I would be curious, given that people have like frequently taken ideas that have been proposed in this event from November and incorporated them into new things or started new projects and hackathons based on this. Do you have like a hope for what you might see from pursuing this marketplace idea, this four-sided marketplace idea, if someone were going to try and take it on? And
yeah, I mean, I guess one observation I have is that the market for virtual goods and games is $80 billion, and that people are willing to pay $2.8 million for a Bored Ape Yacht Club NFT.
I love that you have those numbers off the top of your head.
And while I would not personally spend $2.8 million on an NFT, I guess my question is, if there are people who are willing to do that, could that, token or the idea of the impact certificate, could that mobilize funding for research in areas that are particularly important, and in particular, support the work of a field strategist who would say, this is my strategy for deploying X amount of capital to solve this problem, like, hey, 10 million people a year are going to die if we don't solve the problem of antimicrobial resistance. And I don't know how to do that. Like, could you have a token that represents a given experiment that a researcher does or something like that? But it just seems to me that if people are willing to spend that type of money, if you could take 5% of the market for virtual goods and games, that would be larger than the DARPA budget. So imagine, because the DARPA budget is less than $4 billion. So could we have as a goal getting 5% of the current market for virtual goods for +5 swords or mithril armor or whatever?
That's a brilliant comparison I'd never considered making.
And use that to support a decentralized DARPA.
Yeah, by I presume gamifying research progress in an effective way, which is a hard problem, but very interesting one. I realize we're now at time. We're going to start eating into the break. If you have time for one last question,
sure.
I guess hybrid question. If there's anything that hasn't come up yet that you think would be interesting to mention, that's one. Alternatively, I would be curious to hear if you have a coherent vision for what like a 2 sigma outcome would be for improvement of science policy or practices that we might see in the next couple of years?
Well, I would say it's more a vibe than a practice. And one of the things that I've always been interested in is the creation of positive self-fulfilling prophecies. In the same way that sometimes when someone says, 1 million people should show up in Washington and participate in a march on, women's rights or something like that, and every once in a while, like 1 million people show up. And so the equivalent of that in science and technology policy, I think, is 2 things. One is a really compelling goal. And the second is the why now story. What has changed about the world that leads us to believe that that goal is within reach? And I think that if you can line those 2 things up, that can be a magnet for people and resources, because I think the right reaction to a credible statement like that is to say, like, if you're telling me we could really do X and X is a big deal, and here's why, it's doable, then why the hell aren't we, putting more resources into it? And I just think that there's enough capital sloshing around so that I would like to see, the Moonshot catalog, which is the Neiman Marcus catalog for philanthropists, of different things that they could work on, in the same way that one philanthropist wants to map the brain, and another wants to send a spacecraft to Alpha Centauri, and Bill Gates wants to eradicate polio, and Elon Musk has said, I want to die on Mars, but not on impact. What would it take to create a moonshot culture in which a much larger number of individuals and organizations is involved in the identification and pursuit of these goals? And part of what it means to be a leader of an institution is that you are, trying to mobilize your organization, or you're trying to use your wealth to support the identification and pursuit of these moonshots, of these ambitious but achievable goals. And what would it take to create a culture that is rewarding this and getting lots of people involved, as opposed to, lots of people watching what Elon Musk tweets about?
Citizen science beyond the point where citizens are compute nodes, or like, well, thank you so much for this conversation. I think it's time we wrap this up. This has been inspiring and informative and delightful, and I look forward to speaking more at some point in the future.
Yeah, really enjoyed it. Thanks for the opportunity.